In today's gripping story, we delve into the lives of Josh and Paul. Josh is a businessman drowning in debt, hopeless, and on the verge of losing everything. In a moment of desperation, he spends his last coins on a lottery ticket. The ticket turns out to be a winner, but before he can celebrate, he loses it amidst the bustling streets of New York. On the other hand, Paul, a homeless man living on the streets, finds the ticket and discovers its value. Faced with hunger, cold, and the chance to change his life forever, Paul is confronted with a decision that challenges everything. What happens next is breathtaking and proves that choices can change destinies in ways no one expects. Are you ready for this story? Do you want to experience moments that will make you smile, cry, and reflect on life? Real stories that touch the heart and leave lasting impressions? Then subscribe to the channel now. This way, you'll ensure that these incredible stories always reach you, providing fresh inspiration with every video. It was almost 9 at night when Josh stopped in front of a store window on 5th Avenue. Inside, a family was laughing as they shared an expensive dessert. He sighed and lowered his head. It was hard to believe that just months ago, he could also afford moments like that. Now he was on the brink of losing everything. The startup he had built with so much effort had failed. His apartment was already empty, and with what little he had left, all he could think about was his overdue rent. Josh looked at his reflection in the glass and saw something that frightened him, a shadow of his former self. The rumpled suit, the unshaven beard, and the lost look didn't match the young, ambitious dreamer he once was. Yet here he was, wandering aimlessly through the illuminated streets of New York, desperately trying to find a way out that seemed impossible. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Paul was pulling an old blanket over his shoulders, trying to fend off the cold that cut like knives that night. Beside him was a bag with a few empty cans and a water bottle. He had managed to get some food from a corner stand, but it wasn't enough to fill his stomach. It was the third day in a row that hunger weighed heavily on him. Even so, Paul didn't complain. He had learned that if he got stuck in self-pity, he'd lose the only thing he had left, his dignity. He smiled at passers-by and thanked anyone who tossed a coin into his plastic cup. To many, he was just another invisible person, but inside he carried a value no one could take away. That night, Josh and Paul's paths were about to cross. The young businessman, walking quickly and distracted, tripped over a pile of boxes where Paul was sitting. "Hey, watch it, friend," Paul said, steadying one of the boxes that nearly fell. Josh stopped and looked at the man. He looked tired but had a steady gaze that unnerved him. "Sorry, I didn't see where I was going." Paul smiled. It wasn't the first time someone rushed past without noticing him, but there was something different about this young man. He seemed as lost as Paul himself, despite wearing clothes that suggested he had it all. "It's all right. Tough night?" Paul asked, adjusting the blanket on his shoulder. Josh hesitated before responding. He didn't know why, but he felt he could talk to this man. "You could say that. I've lost everything. My business, my money. Now I'm just trying to figure out what to do with my life." Paul looked at him for a moment and nodded. "Welcome to the club then. The difference is, I've been in this game for years. But you know what? You're still breathing. So that's something, isn't it?" Josh gave a half smile. Paul's words were simple, yet they rang true. He thanked him and went on his way, not realizing that this brief encounter was about to change everything. As Josh disappeared into the crowd, Paul adjusted his belongings and prepared to sleep. He had no idea that just a few streets away, fate was already setting a test in motion, something that could transform him forever. Josh stopped in front of a newsstand on the corner of 42nd and Broadway. His gaze drifted over the headlines, but he barely processed the words. All he could think about was the chaos his life had become. In his pocket, he had his last coins, enough for a cheap coffee or an impulsive gamble. He chose the latter. "Give me a lottery ticket, please," he said, pointing to the display with colorful numbers. The attendant looked him up and down, perhaps noticing the contrast between the worn suit and his weary face, but said nothing. "Good luck, friend." The man handed him the ticket with a faint smile. Josh held the paper as if it were more than just a slip of paper. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine. What if this was the beginning of something better? A prize, even a small one, could ease his debts, maybe help him get back on his feet. He slipped the ticket into the inner pocket of his blazer and continued walking. The streets of New York were as busy as ever, people rushing back and forth, honking horns, voices, and the icy air that seemed to cut through the skin. As he walked, he pulled his phone from his pocket to check his bank balance, as if he needed another reminder of his dire situation. In doing so, he didn't notice the wind snatch something from his blazer pocket. The ticket floated in the air for a moment, dancing among the pedestrians, before landing on the ground. Josh kept walking, unaware of what had just happened. A few steps behind, Paul was sitting in his usual spot near a trash can he used as a windbreak. He saw the young man drop a small piece of paper that fluttered down and landed near the curb. Slowly, he got up and walked over, picking up the paper before the wind could carry it away again. It was a lottery ticket. He looked around. People hurried past, too engrossed in their own lives, and the young man was already out of sight. Paul handled the ticket carefully, almost as if it were fragile. The paper was slightly crumpled, but the printed numbers were clear. He didn't know much about the lottery, but he knew enough to recognize that this piece of paper might hold some value. He chuckled softly alone. "Who loses something like this and doesn't even notice?" he murmured, glancing around once more. But the street remained as bustling and impersonal as always. Rushed people carrying bags, talking on phones, weaving through each other without exchanging glances. Paul knew that at this pace, no one would stop to listen to what he had to say, let alone admit to losing something so important. Sitting back down, he fidgeted with the ticket, folding and unfolding it. The thought of throwing it away crossed his mind for a second. After all, he already had enough problems without worrying about someone else's luck. But something nagged at him. What if this thing is worth something? He said to himself. Suddenly, a thought struck him. This could be someone's salvation, or his own salvation. It was tempting, even if he didn't want to admit it. He looked at the bag beside him, filled with cans and bottles he had collected. That was what he did every day to make a few coins. Paul took a deep breath and shook his head. Calm down, man. Imagining things won't help. He knew he needed information. He decided that in the morning, he would look for a newsstand or store where he could inquire about the ticket's numbers. If no one came forward to claim it, maybe it was a sign that the paper had come into his hands for a reason. While thinking about this, Paul tucked the ticket into his coat pocket. He felt the weight of possibilities pressing against his skin. It was light, but it carried a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. That night before sleeping, he looked up at the sky, where the city lights drowned out any stars that might appear. "Is that how it works?" he whispered. "Good things just happen? Out of nowhere?" He didn't have the answers. All he knew was that the ticket didn't feel like just a piece of paper. What he would do with it, or how it might change things, was still a mystery, but something told Paul it would play an important role in his life. Paul woke up early the next morning, as he did every day. With the ticket still in his coat pocket, he set out to scour the streets for cans and bottles he could sell. The cold was intense, and he rubbed his hands together as he walked. Passing by an electronics store, a movement in the display window caught his eye. There was a huge TV showing the morning news. Paul wasn't one to stop and watch, but something made him pause. In the corner of the screen, numbers flashed with a golden glow, and a red banner highlighted the words, "The largest lottery jackpot in history." "Oh, is that what this is about?" he murmured, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the ticket. He looked at the paper, then back at the numbers on the screen, then back at the paper, and again at the TV. For a moment, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He pressed his face closer to the store's glass, the numbers printed on the ticket burning into his mind. "It can't be," Paul whispered. The announcer confirmed what he had been dreading to believe. That was the winning number. The millions were right there, in that small piece of paper trembling in his hands. Paul backed away from the shop window, as if the glass might explode at any moment. He sat on the curb, staring at the ticket as if it were alive. "Is this real?" he asked himself. How did this end up in my hands?" His mind began to race. With that money, he could get off the streets, buy a house, eat well every day. He'd never feel cold or hungry again. He could even help other people like him. And you, what would you do if something like this fell into your hands? It's intense to think about, isn't it? If this story is already touching your heart and making you reflect, go ahead and leave a like. It's a simple gesture, but helps spread inspiring messages like this one. Now let's find out what Paul decided to do with that ticket. Deep down, something bothered him. Paul knew that ticket wasn't his. He had seen the young man who dropped it, distracted, walking down the street with a heavy expression. It was clear that ticket had an owner, someone who probably needed that luck just as much as Paul did now. He gripped the ticket tightly, as if afraid someone might snatch it from his hands. He looked around, but no one paid him any attention. If I keep this, my life changes, and if I return it, he left the sentence hanging, unsure how to finish it. Minutes dragged on as he stared at the ticket. Every scenario played in his mind like a movie. The Paul who kept the prize, and the Paul who did what he knew was right. But the question that echoed most in his mind was, if it were the other way around, what would he do for me? Paul took a deep breath. He knew the decision had to be made soon, but he couldn't rush it. He wasn't a thief, and that at least was something no one could take from him. Slowly standing, he put the ticket back in his pocket and started walking. The idea of finding the ticket's owner now seemed to be the only thing he could consider. Paul walked the streets with the ticket in his pocket, feeling the invisible weight of that decision. He had already spent hours sitting on a bench, reflecting on what to do. From time to time, he would put his hand in his pocket to make sure the ticket was still there. "It's not mine," he murmured to himself, almost like a mantra. It was true. He hadn't bought that ticket, nor dreamed up the numbers. All he knew was that, on that night, he had seen a young man rush by and drop something on the ground. He closed his eyes, trying to remember the details. The guy seemed tense, wearing a wrinkled suit and walking heavily, like someone carrying the weight of the world. Paul didn't know his name or where he came from, but he remembered the expression on his face, a mix of desperation and exhaustion, something Paul knew well. It's him. It has to be him. Paul's conviction grew stronger with every second. Even with the biting cold and his hunger gnawing at him, he knew he had to find that man, not because he expected to be rewarded, but because it was the right thing to do. And if there was one thing Paul wouldn't compromise on, it was his values. Paul retraced his steps from the previous night. He went through the same places, looking at every face intently, hoping to spot the young man. He stopped at every busy corner, asking passersby, "Hey, have you seen a guy in a suit? Tall, kind of messy hair?" The responses varied between head shakes and hurried glances. "No, sir, sorry," one man said, veering off to continue his way. Paul felt discouragement creeping in but didn't give up. He knew finding someone in New York was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but something inside him pushed him to keep going. Near the park where he had last seen the young man, Paul stopped and observed. The benches, the people coming and going. Nothing seemed familiar until he spotted a small detail, a crumpled piece of paper near a bench. It wasn't the ticket, but it was exactly where he remembered seeing the young man pause briefly. Paul sat there for a while, thinking. The feeling that he was in the right place was strong, but it didn't mean he would find the man that day. Even so, he made a silent promise. He wouldn't give up. He looked up at the cloudy sky and murmured, "Just give me a sign, okay? Something to show me I'm on the right path." With his hand in his pocket gripping the ticket, Paul continued his search. He knew it would be tough, but he was determined. That little piece of paper could change many things, and he wanted it to change the right way. He was already exhausted. Days had gone by, walking through the city, questioning strangers, and trying to retrace the young man's steps. With each passing hour, the weight of doubt grew heavier. Did he really believe he could find someone in such a big city? That morning, he decided to return to the park where he thought he'd seen the young man for the last time. The place looked the same, with an endless stream of unfamiliar faces. Paul walked around the park, observing carefully. Then he saw him. Sitting on a bench, head down, elbows on his knees, was Josh. He looked lost in thought, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Paul stopped in his tracks and took a deep breath. It was him. He was sure of it. There's the sign I asked for, Paul murmured to himself. With the ticket in his pocket, he approached cautiously. He didn't want to scare him, but he also didn't know how to start. When he was just a few steps away, he said, "Hey, buddy." Josh slowly looked up, his face confused at the sight of the man standing in front of him. "Remember me?" Paul asked. "A few days ago, you almost tripped over some boxes." Josh frowned, trying to recall. When the memory clicked, he nodded, surprised. "Oh yeah, nah, sorry about that." Paul smiled faintly and reached into his pocket. He pulled out the folded ticket, holding it between his fingers. "This is yours, isn't it?" Josh stared at the paper, his eyes widening. He froze for a moment, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. "What? How?" He quickly stood, grabbing the ticket from Paul's hands. I lost this. I know, I saw you drop it that night. I picked it up and have been trying to find you ever since." Josh stared at the ticket as if it were a piece of gold. He looked back at Paul, still in disbelief. "You searched for me?" "For days?" Josh asked, his voice filled with surprise. Paul shrugged and said, "It was the right thing to do. This wasn't mine." Josh ran a hand over his face, trying to process it. He knew the value of that ticket and what it meant. A winning ticket, capable of changing anyone's life. And Paul, who clearly needed it just as much as he did, chose to return it. "I don't even know how to thank you for this," Josh said, his voice thick with emotion. Paul gave a small smile. "No need to thank me, man. Just to make good use of it, okay?" Josh was silent for a moment. He looked at the ticket and then at Paul. An idea began to form in his mind, something he knew he had to do. That encounter on the park bench felt like more than coincidence. It was as if both of them were destined to change each other. And in that moment, the course of Josh and Paul's lives began to transform. Josh held the winning ticket as if it might evaporate at any moment. That little piece of paper was the solution to all his problems. He thought about the overdue bills, the mounting debts, and how his life was on the brink of collapse. But as he looked at the ticket, he couldn't ignore the figure of Paul standing in front of him. "Man, you have no idea what you just did for me," Josh said, still in disbelief. "I did what I thought was right. If I were in your shoes, I'd hope someone would do the same." Josh laughed, but not out of humor. It was the nervous laughter of someone who could barely believe the kindness he had just witnessed. He looked at Paul with a mix of admiration and perplexity. "Seriously, you weren't tempted to—" Josh hesitated but continued. "To keep it?" Paul gave a small smile, but his expression was serious. "Of course, I was. Who wouldn't be? But look at me. I'm not in this life because I chose it, you know? But if I lost the little dignity I still have, then I'd be done." Those words echoed in Josh's mind. He felt a weight, not from the ticket he had almost lost, but from the lesson he had just received. Paul, even facing the most extreme hardships, had chosen to do what was right. Josh looked again at the ticket and then at Paul. He knew he couldn't simply thank him and move on. That wouldn't be fair. They remained on that park bench, still trying to process what had just happened. The winning ticket now felt like a bond between them, not just a piece of paper. Josh pulled the ticket out of his pocket once again and placed it on the bench between them. He looked at Paul, who was staring at the piece of paper with a mix of admiration and apprehension. "Paul, I've already decided. Half of this is yours." Paul laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. He shook his head in disbelief. "Look, I appreciate your generosity, but this doesn't make any sense. That money's yours. I just returned what was already yours." Josh leaned forward, clasping his hands like someone about to present an irrefutable argument. "And do you think if the roles were reversed, I'd have done the same thing you did?" Paul remained silent, surprised by the sincerity in Josh's voice. "To be honest, I don't know. Maybe not. And that's exactly why I need to do this. You showed me something I didn't even know still existed. Integrity, man." Paul looked away, uncomfortable. He wasn't used to receiving compliments, let alone something of this magnitude. "But I didn't do anything beyond my duty. And that's what makes you different." Josh pointed at him, emphasizing each word. "Anyone else in your position would have kept that ticket. You didn't. You chose to do the right thing, even if it meant giving up a fortune. Paul sighed, still uncertain. Even so, splitting this money with me, I don't know, man. It feels wrong. Josh laughed, but kindly. Wrong would be for me to take everything and move on like you hadn't changed my life. Paul, you deserve this as much as I do. If you hadn't returned it, we wouldn't even be here right now. Paul stared at the ground, slowly shaking his head. He still couldn't believe this was happening. It's a lot of money, Josh. This could change everything. Exactly, Josh replied, his tone firm. It can change everything for me and for you. Look at us. I was drowning in debt, with no hope. You're trying to get by day. This prize isn't just a coincidence. It's a chance to turn our lives around. Paul was quiet for a long time, as if battling something within himself. All right, man, he finally said, raising his hands in surrender. But are you sure about this? Josh smiled, relieved. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Paul let out a short laugh, still processing the decision. You're crazy, you know that? Maybe I am, Josh replied, laughing too. But I think sometimes you have to be a little crazy to do the right thing. At that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just an agreement. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The prize was just the start. The bond they had formed, forged by a gesture of honesty and restitution, was already starting to transform their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. As they walked together to find a way to formalize the split, Paul finally allowed a small spark of hope to ignite within him. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, he believed the future could be different. The following days felt like a dream for Paul. The money transferred by Josh was in his account, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel crushed by the uncertainty of where his next meal would come from. But more than the financial change, something deeper filled him, the chance to start over. Paul began with the basics. The first thing he did was rent a small apartment. It wasn't big or luxurious, but for him it was more than enough. The feeling of closing the door behind him and knowing that space was his was indescribable. I never thought a roof could mean so much, he murmured, looking around the almost empty room. He bought new clothes, simple but decent, which helped him regain something he felt he had lost years ago. The dignity of looking in the mirror and liking what he saw. Then he went straight to a community center, where he heard they were hiring maintenance staff. During the interview, the supervisor observed him closely as he answered the questions. "So why do you want to work here, Paul?" she asked, looking directly at him. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled, deciding to be honest. "Because I know what it's like to need help, and if I can keep this place running, maybe I can help others find a way, just like I found mine." He was hired on the spot. Paul woke up early every morning and walked to the community center with determined steps. He cleaned, fixed what needed to be fixed, and made a point to talk to the people who came there for help. He listened to stories of hard lives, and that kept him motivated. But Paul knew he could do more. He started saving part of what was left of the prize to create survival kits for homeless people. Blankets, socks, non-perishable food, and hygiene items. He distributed the kits personally on the same streets where he had once struggled to survive. One night, while handing a blanket to a man lying under an awning, the man looked at him and asked, "Why do you do this?" Paul smiled and said, "Because someone believed in me when I thought there was no way out. Now it's my turn to believe in you." Meanwhile, Josh sat at the table in his empty apartment with a pile of bills in front of him. The winning ticket, now converted into a substantial amount in his bank account, felt almost unreal. He paid off his debts one by one, with each payment notification bringing a profound sense of relief. "Finally," he murmured, looking at the last receipt. But even free from the financial chains that had suffocated him, Josh felt that something had changed within him. Paul's gesture stayed with him. That man who had so little had chosen to do the right thing without expecting anything in return. This lesson echoed in his mind. Josh realized he didn't just want to fix his own life. He wanted to do something bigger. He knew what it was like to be on the brink, with no prospects and no support, and he decided to use his second chance to help others rebuild. That's how the idea of creating a foundation was born. He started making plans, scribbling ideas on loose sheets of paper, turning every lesson and difficulty he had faced into something practical to help others. Phoenix Fund, he wrote at the top of a page, symbolizing rebirth from the ashes. The foundation would have two main focuses: helping struggling entrepreneurs get back on their feet and providing support to vulnerable people like Paul had been. Josh wanted his foundation to be a bridge between those who were falling and those willing to extend a hand. With the foundation underway, Josh began organizing events and lectures where he shared his story. He talked about what he had learned from his failures and how an unexpected act of kindness had changed everything. What makes the difference isn't how much you have, but what you choose to do with it, Josh told his audience. The foundation grew quickly, attracting support from local business owners and even celebrities inspired by the story. Over time, it began impacting hundreds of lives, helping save businesses, get families off the streets, and restore hope to those who had stopped believing in second chances. At a fundraising event, the room was full. People from all walks of life, business owners, volunteers, families, and curious onlookers had gathered to celebrate stories of overcoming adversity and the impact the foundation was having. Josh walked among the tables, greeting guests and checking the final details. He wore a well-fitted suit, but the sparkle in his eyes was what stood out the most. It wasn't about the flashes or applause, but about the meaning of that night. On the other side of the room, Paul observed everything with a discreet smile. He still wasn't entirely comfortable with so much luxury around him, but he knew he couldn't miss that moment. He adjusted his jacket, a gift from Josh, and sighed. "Ready for this, Paul?" a volunteer who recognized him asked. Paul chuckled softly and replied, "Not at all. But let's do this." The highlight of the night was the speech by Josh and Paul. They had prepared something together, but Paul still felt more like the guy behind the story than someone who deserved to be on stage. Even so, when his name was announced, he stepped onto the stage alongside Josh to a round of applause. Josh took the microphone and smiled at the audience. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Tonight is special, not just for me, but for so many people. And I want to start by sharing something that changed my life." He paused, looking at Paul beside him. "A few months ago, I hit rock bottom. I lost everything: my business, my confidence, and even my hope. That's when I met this man right here." Paul smiled, visibly uncomfortable in the spotlight. Josh continued, "Paul found me at a time when I didn't even believe in myself anymore. He could have moved on with his life, ignored my situation, but he made a choice that changed the course of both of our lives." Josh handed the microphone to Paul, who took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm not very good with words, but I'll try." He chuckled, drawing some laughs from the audience. "When I found that lottery ticket, my first thought was that it could solve all my problems. And believe me, I had plenty." He looked at the crowd, his tone serious. "But something told me it wasn't the right thing to do. So I set out to find the owner, not knowing who they were or if they'd even listen to me." Paul paused, glancing at Josh. "When I finally found him, I discovered that the ticket didn't just belong to him. It belonged to both of us. Because what he did next, sharing it with me, was more than just generosity. It was believing that I could change." The audience applauded, moved. Josh took the microphone again and concluded, "This story isn't just about us. It's about how choices can transform lives." Today, Paul is here not as someone who received help, but as someone who inspired all of this. Josh gestured to the screen behind them, which began displaying photos of people helped by the foundation, entrepreneurs rebuilding their businesses, families getting off the streets, and children being given a new chance. All of this started with one simple choice. He chose to do the right thing, and that changed everything. Josh extended his hand to Paul, who grasped it firmly. The two stood there hand in hand as the audience gave a standing ovation. In that moment, both knew they weren't just celebrating a story, but starting something much bigger. A message that small choices, rooted in values and empathy, can have profound and lasting impacts. As they stepped off the stage, Josh whispered to Paul, "Think it was worth it, partner?" Paul gave a broad smile and replied, "It was worth every second." The story of Josh and Paul shows us that a single choice can change everything. An act of honesty, a selfless decision, the courage to believe in someone else. These are the actions that create impact. Now think about it. What would you have done in Paul's place? And if you were Josh, would you have had the courage to share what life gave you? Share in the comments what you would do. The world is full of moments like this, where our choices, big or small, have the power to transform not only our own lives, but also the lives of those around us. If you enjoy stories that inspire, move, and make you reflect, subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find content that can transform your day, and who knows, maybe even your life. Click now and join this community that believes in the power of kindness and honesty.